Brilliant. So as I said, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like to, and if you've got any questions as we go along, then pop them in the chat and we'll cover them at the end of the session. I'm going to hand over now to Kieran and Emma from Taylor Vintners, who are going to talk through setting up and establishing a social venture. Kieran.
Great. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this session today. So we're going to start with introductions. My name is Kieran. I'm a charity and social venture lawyer at Taylor Vintners, and we operate in the kind of innovation hubs of the UK, including Oxford, which is really exciting. So we kind of support charities and impact-aligned organisations throughout the full life cycle, getting them set up, getting contracts in place, securing funding for their impact, and then kind of drawing in colleagues from throughout the firm with their specialisms in employment or property or whatever to kind of deliver that service to the client. So I joined the team about 3.5 years ago, and perhaps I can, I do obviously do lots of the work day to day, but I'm also involved in various things like virtual pop-ups, which we'll talk about a bit later, and podcast series and other reports that we'll link to a bit later on. So they're all linked in our slide deck. So if you'd like to find a bit more about those, we can you can download them later. But I'll now hand over to Emma to introduce herself and then run through the first few parts of the session.
Great, thanks, Kieran. Yeah, so like Kieran, also specialise in working with charities and social ventures. I've been with Taylor Vintners for around 11 years now, actually. It's been quite a while. I sort of forget, past the furniture. But as I say, always sort of worked with not-for-profits, much like Kieran, throughout their entire life cycle. So great to have us and be with you here today. Thank you to Rosie and Grant for the invitation. We absolutely are very keen to give back to this space, given how sort of collaborative the social enterprise sector is anyway. So yeah, we're very, very keen to sort of participate and be a part of that. So hence today's talk, which is very much intended to be sort of through the outlines of what social ventures are, why people might set them up, the legal structures to really sort of give you that vehicle to put a wrapper around your idea and take that forward. But aiming for us to have a little bit more time towards the end so we can address any questions that you might have. If you don't feel comfortable sharing those on a group or something you think is perhaps a little bit more involved, by all means do feel free to reach out to us separately afterwards, and Kieran will, as I say, talk through the pop-up sessions that we do offer to social entrepreneurs as well, which is something that you are absolutely free to use as it suits. So just to sort of kick us off, really, next slide please, Kieran. I'm going to do that, I'm afraid, whilst Kieran's hosting the slides. What is a social venture and why do people set them up? You might absolutely have some inklings of that already. You may have an embryonic idea or the early stages of a social venture. But for those perhaps who are newer to the space and thinking that they have an idea but aren't quite sure how to crystallise that as of yet, next slide please, Kieran. We have what we call the social venture equation, which is just intended to be a way that we've looked to encapsulate the drivers that create and underlie a social venture business. So what we clearly have there, as you'll see, is a social purpose, the sort of underlying theme, motivation for setting up the company, coupled with an entrepreneurial approach. So you know that perhaps you want to do things with a trading focus, be that goods or services, as opposed to a charitable endeavour, and combine those two elements. And in our view, what you then form is a social venture. When we speak about social ventures, we talk about a slightly sort of broader church, if you will, than perhaps some other lawyers or sector commentators might do when they talk about social enterprise. We'll come on to that just in the next slide, just to give you a little bit more context there.
Cool. So I'm going to hand over to our video to talk about the social venture concept, and hopefully the tech works okay, but give me a shout if you can't hear this.
Great. So I hope what that demonstrates is that there is a huge variety in the social venture space. You'll have seen from some of the examples there of very, very different things that these companies are undertaking. But what is the sort of common thread that links them all together, if you will, is that it's absolutely that social driver that is at the forefront of the mission and purpose of the company, and that underpins all the decisions that the organization and the directors will take in furthering that chosen social or environmental mission. So moving on to the next slide, to help give you a little bit of context in charting the different legal structures that are available. Thinking back to that social venture equation, there are various parts, if you like, that a social venture can plot on this particular scale. So what you'll see is we have charity on the one hand and a traditional for-profit business on the other. And where a social venture sits really will depend on the elements that it decides to bake into its constitution, and sort of cherry pick certain elements. So just to very sort of briefly talk through some of the more well-known structures that you might be familiar with already. A community interest company, for example, is a top-up registration form. It has a company as its underlying legal structure, but then has a separate registration process with the KIC regulator who sits within Companies House. It's a fairly rigid social venture structure, social enterprise structure, that will almost be very much sort of more on that charity end of the scale, because it will have, for a number of its companies, either completely asset locked if it's a company limited guarantee, or a company limited by shares that chooses the asset locked option, or a 65-35 split in the payment of its dividends. So ensuring that the bulk of the distributable profits of the company are reinvested back in furtherance of its social purpose. So it very much sits there. By contrast, you might have something that actually wants to be much more sort of fluid in its ability to pay dividends, for example, to private individuals, have a broader group of shareholders, but still want to put some sort of social environmental drivers at the forefront of what it does. And that actually might shift on that scale to sit much more comfortably in the sort of middle to sort of for-profit element of what it's doing. But it may, for example, still want to undertake impact reporting to ensure that it's holding itself out and being accountable to its external stakeholders. It may have some curbs on its ability to pay dividends to private individuals, but not as onerous perhaps as the requirements of the KIC regulator. So the sort of takeaway point there is that there's a certain element of cherry picking, if you like, to determine where your given venture might sit on that scale, depending on what you and your potential other co-founders want or need from the business, the optics of your external stakeholders and what they think would be valuable, for example, whether they would need to see you sort of operating as externally regulated, holding yourself out in a more sort of conventional, entirely not-for-profit, or again, whether they're a little bit more commercial and fluid in their expectations. So a whole suite of things and a very broad landscape that we can fit on to make it work for you and deliver the best outcomes for you as founders, but also for your beneficiaries and stakeholders. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the legal structures that are available to social entrepreneurs, there's a few, and some of these I will very much just mention in passing. So partnerships where two or more individuals club together for a joint purpose. There's no independent legal structure there, so the individuals are absolutely on the hook for the business they are undertaking, which led to the creation of a LLP, limited liability partnership structure, a good few years ago now. It's pretty rare to come across that, I would say. More often than not, it might be something that perhaps involves some more complex property-based transactions where we tend to see those structures, but certainly not common for social entrepreneurs. Community benefit societies are entities that are formed primarily for the benefit of the members of the society. and will have interests for a larger community or the general public. The profits will be used to further those societies' aims. They do crop up every now and again. Housing societies, maybe particular sort of social institutions that choose the CBS structure. There is the possibility for sort of a charitable certification, if you like, from HMRC. So those CBSs can benefit from some of the tax exemptions that conventional registered charities would benefit from. Yeah, and I can see the comment there absolutely between the difference between CBSs and cooperatives, absolutely right, as to who the members are and where that benefit sits. But for social enterprises and social ventures, by and large, the majority of social founders will choose a private limited company as the underlying legal structure. Next slide, please, Kieran. There's a few reasons for that, which we've listed here. So first and foremost, simplicity. It is a well-known legal structure. It's very simple to set it up by way of just a simple incorporation process through Companies House. The documentation is all fairly user-friendly and self-explanatory, so there isn't sort of any immediate hurdle in that sense to forming a company. Absolutely well-known in the sense that everybody sort of knows what you're talking about when you say, yeah, I've got a company. So there's that familiarity for your external dealings with other individuals. It has the benefit of separate legal personality, so it can enter into contracts, it can engage staff and the like, and do so in the company's name rather than the individual shareholders, members, or directors. And on top of that as well, it offers limited liability. So you, as shareholders of a company, your liability is in a sense capped at the amount of any unpaid shares you have, or in the case of a company limited by guarantee, your personal guarantee as a member, which is normally a nominal figure, be it £1 or £10 at most. Again, so there's no sort of financial chilling effect or hurdle to set up. It also has the benefit of potentially separation between the ownership and management of the company, meaning that you can absolutely have a closed structure where your company directors and members or shareholders are the same individuals. And that can be helpful in terms of the decision-making process because it's all the same people around the table, albeit sometimes they may need to wear different hats, if you will, for certain decisions. Equally, if you feel as an organisation it would be useful to engage a broader group of stakeholders at a constitutional level, you can invite those wider participants to become company members. And then they have certain sort of ad hoc constitutional backstop powers, like the ability to approve any updates to the company's constitutional documents, but they don't need to get involved in the day-to-day strategic running of the company, which is something that is reserved for the directors. So absolutely up to you and dependent on the nature of the business and who your stakeholders are in that sense, but it's a nice offering to have if that's of use of you to build in a broader membership base and the support that can come from that. Next slide, please. So in terms of private companies, there is a fundamental split between whether you choose to be limited by guarantee or limited by shares. The clue is in the name to a certain extent. So a company limited by shares will have a shareholding, it will have share capital. It can be set up with a nominal share capital. So, for example, each shareholder coming on board can initially have a £1 share in the company, for example. But as you grow, scale, you could bring on board additional investors to grow the company and increase the shareholding in that sense. A company limited by guarantee will have members as opposed to shareholders, so there will be no shareholding, and those members, as I mentioned, will guarantee a nominal amount in the event of the company's winding up. Which option you choose will largely depend on these sort of factors here, really. Limited liability, it's worth saying, will be encompassed both companies limited by guarantee and companies limited by shares. So that's nice to have that safety net for both organisations. The fundamental differences come down to the treatment of profits and external investors. So in a company limited by guarantee, as there is no shareholding, those companies are asset locked. So the assets of the company will be reinvested back into that business in furtherance of its social purposes. There is not the ability for the members to privately benefit from the assets of the company. Contrast that with a company limited by shares, where clearly, unless you choose to impose some other restrictions, you would be able to participate in dividend payments, provided that the company has sufficient distributable profits to pay dividends. External investors, as you'll see there, would be looking or would be potentially interested in coming on board with a company limited by shares. That's very unlikely to be the case in a company limited by guarantee. Hence, you tend to see that sort of funding split between equity investment in companies limited by shares by way of growth, companies limited by guarantee tending to fall more on the grants of funding. So again, a sort of question for social entrepreneurs at an early stage as to where they think the business might scale and where their funding opportunities might come from further down the line. And just to reinforce this point as well, as we spoke about earlier, the difference potentially between owners and managers of a business. So in a private company limited by guarantee, the company's ownership will be the members, who will have the ability to review the articles of association and approve those. They will have certain other sort of rights that are built in by the Companies Act, but the strategic day-to-day control and legal duties and responsibilities will fall to the directors. That's very similar, again, to the approach with a company limited by shares, the distinction just being whether we have members or shareholders. And the general takeaway point there is that companies limited by guarantee, thinking back to that social venture scale, are much more likely to sit on the sort of charitable side of things. So a company limited by guarantee tends to be the legal structure for a number of corporate charities. So that's very sort of analogous with those types of organisations. Companies limited by shares, given that they have the ability to pay dividends, that they have a shareholding capital, tend to feature more on that side of the scale towards a traditional for-profit business. Next slide, please. Thank you. So some of the key questions and social venture models that we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive on. To think through some of the questions that arise as a social founder and thinking through your options for what the right legal structure might be, we have 5 questions that we tend to sort of prompt people on to think through what legal structure might be right for them. You'll see those here. So starting at the top, we have governance. What we tend to look to explore with that question is, how regulated do you want your organisation to be? Do you think that your venture will gain credibility from external supervision or as I say, in the eyes of stakeholders? If so, that might lean us more towards, for example, the community interest company model and options, given it has a specific regulator that sits within Companies House. In terms of people, good question to think about, well, who will be involved with the organisation? How much control do the founders want or need to have? Do you need to financially incentivize key executive staff? What about a wider pool of employees potentially? Do you as a founders need to well, how do you need to make an income from this? Will it just be a salaried position, or would you also be looking potentially to have the ability to pay yourselves dividends further down the line? Funding, as I mentioned, that's a fairly sort of critical question between that sort of equity grant split, but equally thinking through, well, what are the trading opportunities for this particular venture? Because your earned income, your revenue that you're generating by way of your sales, be it goods or services, clearly in some ways will be the best form of funding for your organization, because there's no strings attached with that, whether that's meeting the requirements and expectations of external shareholders, or reporting requirements and the like of grant funders. Intellectual property, that will sort of come into play in varying degrees, but I mean, you may have a business idea that actually is completely underpinned by IP as a critical aspect for the service delivery, for example. But if that's not the case, it's still worth thinking through some of the valuable IP that you might have, particularly around a brand name or any sort of copyright materials and the like that you are producing. It's worthwhile thinking through if you've collaborated with anybody in the development of those type of materials to ensure that everybody, or who has the ownership rights for those works, that you lock down what you need to function as an organization, and ensure that you either own the IP or you have the necessary rights to use that as you need to going forward. And purpose, really crucial, clearly, if we're talking about social ventures. But what is the purpose of your venture? How can you distill and define that in a succinct and impactful way? And how do you measure your impact going forward? There's a couple of ways really that social ventures might look to do that. One clearly might be, it absolutely stems from the nature of the activities that they're undertaking. Others, it might also almost be sort of slightly more subtle, and in some ways they sort of outsource the impact, if you like. So to give you an example there, a community interest company that you might have heard of From Babies with Love. So it has a lovely range of baby wear and toys and whatnot. I mean, on top of it, selling products for babies is not necessarily a social venture, but the social element comes in there because they donate their profits to charities. So they work very closely with, for example, SOS Children's Villages, and therefore they're sort of outsourcing the impact, if you like, of you're buying this product and it's helping this charitable organisation, above and beyond the way that you would see in a sort of corporate partnership relationship of, buy a packet of sweets and 10% gets donated to this nominated charity. So it is much more sort of holistic in that sense. But other organisations, absolutely, the sort of social element will be really front and centre of what they are doing. So how are social ventures funded? There are a good few options. Some of these will absolutely be on the table for any conventional business. So investment debt, so investors' money in exchange for shares. If you have a shareholding and a company limited by shares, debt clearly available for any type of business where you would go to either a specialist social enterprise or social impact funder, or a high street bank. But clearly that will have strings attached, investment and interest payments that would be payable on that within a specific period of time. What we are tending to see is actually a little bit more fluidity in the social funding space, where players like Social Investment Business and the like are actually looking to be more hybrid in their approach, if I can put it that way, of almost sort of straddling and creating products that are a split between a loan and a grant fund. So you have a sort of immediate short-term funding that may come from the grant element, but a longer-term loan sitting behind that to provide perhaps a little bit more flexibility to the social business. And I think that's certainly something that's quite welcome in the sector, of providing that flex for social entrepreneurs. Revenue, as I touched on, so what are you actually sort of generating independently, if you like, from the sales of your goods or services, and one of the best forms of funding that you can have for your organisation. Grant funding, as you know, sort of institutional grant funders will give you a chunk of money. Some of that particularly might still be rather project-based. There are some grant funders that are becoming, again, more relaxed in that approach, and appreciating that actually social businesses, charities do have core costs that, particularly in this sort of cost of living crisis, are very difficult to resource in some senses. So there is a need certainly to plug that gap. But as I say, that's still a little sort of difficult to come across sometimes. So traditional grant funding will particularly still be project-based in its outcomes, deliverables, and the reporting requirements that will go on top of that. Crowdfunding is one that we sort of see from time to time. Clearly, it has a very sort of big grassroots opportunity and offering of individuals or social businesses wanting to raise potentially sort of smaller amounts of money, but from a larger group of funders, in exchange for the funding and support. Individuals might receive certain benefits. It could be equity to a small extent if it's a shareholding company. Otherwise, it might be other sort of perks and benefits for a company to by guarantee. And licensing and franchise, if a company has valuable IP, it could look to create some revenue and generate income from that by licensing the use of those materials to other interested organizations. A franchise will be essentially where you sort of give a playbook and allow another corporate entity to replicate your business using your branding, your internal operational manuals and the like. It's something I have seen in a couple of instances crop up with social businesses. So to give you some examples there, a couple of years ago, I had a social supermarket, so affiliated with a food bank that actually felt like it had a very successful operating model, and was approached by another charitable partner that wanted to sort of see what they were doing in a fairly sort of carbon copy way. So we created, as I say, the sort of franchise playbook and elements and contractual elements to sit around that to allow another party to take on the model of that business and also look to operate it on a successful and sustainable basis. Next slide, please. Thank you, Kieran. So yes, thinking through those sort of high level questions of governance and people and IP and the like, if you've thought through those and sort of had a slightly filtering process as to where you think you might need to fit, we then come back to this social venture scale and the different models, and particularly where they might plot on here. So really, this is just by way of recap. We've touched on some of this previously. You'll see, as I say, community interest companies being much more sort of on the charity side of the spectrum. Just a little bit more detail on KICs, given that they are fairly prevalent for social enterprises. There are 3 potential models of community interest companies, so it can be a little bit confusing on the face of it. One will be a company limited by guarantee. That's fairly straightforward. One will be a company limited by shares, as I mentioned, that in a sense sort of completely chooses to asset lock its assets, so it will be precluded from paying dividends to its shareholders. The other will allow some payment of dividends up to a sort of maximum of 35% of the distributable profits, ensuring that the bulk and that 65% is reinvested back into the business. The community interest registration process is relatively straightforward as well. You will need to specify what your nominated community purpose is, and there will be ongoing annual reporting requirements that will be made to the KIC regulator to sort of keep yourself accountable in that sense, and ensure that you are continuing to fulfill that community purpose. Social enterprises, when we speak about this, really we're talking about what sector bodies like Social Enterprise UK would consider to be a social enterprise. So it would be a business that undertakes trading, be it by goods or services. The distinction that Social Enterprise UK brings into play is they suggest a 50-50 dividend split, so ensuring that a minimum of 50% of the distributable profits go back into the business. So you'll already see that that's a slightly lower threshold than the sort of KIC stipulations, hence why it is slightly further along in that scale towards the for-profit generating business, but still very much, as I say, an equal split between what might be available to private individuals and what goes back into the business. B Corps is a really interesting one. I mean, it's very hard to argue with the fantastic marketing and networking opportunities that the B Corp movement has brought. What I would say is that a social enterprise can be a B Corp, but certainly not all B Corps are social enterprises. So if you think of some of the more sort of well-known B Corps that have badged themselves very successfully, perhaps sort of in the retail space, be it sort of Jude's Ice Cream, for example, or Emma's Kitchen children's snacks and whatnot. They may be doing great things of looking to be more holistic in their better business outlook and think about their supply chains and environmental impact and the like. But there is no reinvestment in a core social or environmental mission in that sense. They are profit generating businesses, but they are just looking to conduct themselves in a better, more ethical way. But what I would say is that the badging of B Corp and the label of being affiliated with the B Corp movement can be very useful for certain organizations. So again, if you think that that's something that perhaps lends itself to your idea and the wider sort of networking and stakeholder recognition of the B Corp mark, by all means, it may be very well something that's worth exploring for the certification process. And then we also have pledged percentage of profits, which is more of a movement really, but there are certain organisations, 1% for the Planet would probably be the best well-known example, whereby businesses look to pledge a certain percent of their profits to other not-for-profit organisations and philanthropic causes. So slightly, as I say, the sort of outsourced element there of the impact for a social venture. Next slide, please, Kieran, if that's okay.
Cool. I think on to the legal shopping list now. So I thought before I go on and talk about that, I might mention that we produced a blog for Independent Oxford, which I believe should be coming out in the next month or so, Rosie, where we spotlight some examples in Oxford of community interest companies, social enterprises, and B Corp. So whenever that drops, worth checking out and supporting those local organisations that are examples on social venture scale. But now we'll go on to part 4 of the session and talk about what we like to call the legal shopping list. So I think, when you start a business, there's perhaps a bit of apprehension. There's a lot of things to do, a lot of legal things to consider. We like to break it down to 3 kind of categories. So we like to start with the kind of must-haves when you're setting up a company, the things that you have to do, basically. The next category are the sensible things to have. Just, if you're looking to put things in place to kind of set you up on the right path. And the third category is kind of the things if you're wanting to plan ahead. So throughout this part of the session, we'll go through into examples of each different category, but I'm going to start first with the must-haves. So I think the first must-have is a constitution. So the company's constitution is typically, as Emma said, for a private limited company, is articles of association and any resolutions that have subsequently amended those articles. So what this does is basically kind of rules for how the company operates, how decisions are taken, how many directors you have, what they can and can't do. So it's really the kind of core document for the organisation to make sure that you are set up correctly and you are operating as you should be. So you've got a couple of options about how to prepare this document. So you could go down the model articles route, which are effectively kind of like template articles, which you can get online when you apply to incorporate a company. You pay, I think, about £12 and you've got your articles and you're kind of good to go with your constitution. Unfortunately, there's not currently a kind of mechanism from kind of the central company's house about embedding kind of social aspects or environmental aspects into your constitution as the kind of template version. So if you want to set up your company as a social venture, you have to have kind of more bespoke articles that no matter what articles you choose, the key thing to flag is that they are published online. So theoretically anyone can see and have a look at them. All they have to do is find your company number, type it into the company's house register, and then go from there. So if you want to do some sleuthing yourself, you can also do that and have a look at other organizations, articles association, but that's the first must-have. The second must-have is the kind of application process, how you go about incorporating a company. So what you do is fill in a form IN01, which you can do online now, which is good. You pay £12 web incorporation fee, and you typically have a company registered within sort of 3 working days. But if you need to get it open for a particular reason, for instance, so if you need to incorporate a company for a particular reason, such as to enter into a contract or get the ball moving and opening a bank account, you can pay a £30 incorporation fee, and you should be able to have a company incorporated in the same day. So you can move really quickly by incorporating a company, which is often good to know. So that's our second must-have. The third and final must-have is the company name. So obviously you'll have branding considerations for your name, but there's also legal considerations as well. And I think the key one is that the legal name of your company can't be the same as another registered company's name. So the way you check that out is by going on Companies House's company name availability checker. You type in the proposed name and it will give you an instant result, whether it's the same as a registered company's name or similar to. So at that stage, you can either decide to change the name and sort of play around with different variations of that name and see if that's available, or you could you could think about having a trading name of the company, which is more the external branding, and having a legal name which is available and you can use. So that's something which you definitely recommend doing. Another thing which is worth doing is checking if an organizational person has registered a trademark under the name you want to trade under. So again, you can fortunately check that by looking at the trademark availability checker, and that's gives you a result of what trademark you want to use and different categories and that kind of stuff. So hopefully that result comes back positive and you can go out and trade under that company name you want to use. If it comes back that another organization has registered a trademark in that name, you've got a couple of options. So you can actually go and change name and kind of start from scratch, or you could go and contact the holder of the registered trademark and say, can I use this under this circumstances and this territory or this category of trademark? Expect they'll probably want you to pay a fee for that and maybe some legal negotiations about that. So that's something to consider, but it's definitely worth thinking about this from kind of day one before you go down the step of doing all your branding and external facing comms, because you want to make sure that's all tidied up. So if you are available, if that sort of trademark is available, it's worth considering protecting that brand. So as you become more established, you'll be the one that someone would come to and say, can I use this trademark in this particular area? So it's definitely worth doing that. I think we'll now go on to what we like to call the should haves. So the key one is this document called a shareholders agreement or members agreement, and as Emma said earlier, the kind of terminology depends on which legal form you take for your private limited company. But no matter which one you do, it's essentially a private contract which sits alongside the articles, but as it's a private document, it's not available online. So because of that, you might go into a bit more detail on things like voting rights or transfers of shares or appointment of directors. And particularly if you're involved in this with a co-founder, one of the co-founders may want to leave at some point, but you'd want to kind of set the process in line to make sure that if they do leave, it doesn't cause doesn't cause any disruption to the company. So it's worth pinning it down from day one while you're getting on as well. So it's not a mandatory thing to have, but it's often sensible to have, because you like to think from day one you're kind of all getting on, you're all on the same page, but that might not be the case when you're a bit further down the line. So it's often worth doing that from day one if you can. So the final part of the section, we'll talk about the things to consider if you're planning ahead. And this ultimately kind of depends on what your business does and how you're set up. But in general, broad terms, there's some things to think about, such as the terms and conditions. That's the top of here, and that's a contract between your business and the customer that supplies goods or services you provide goods or services to. So ideally you'd have your kind of template terms and conditions which you're familiar with, and if you've got a wider team supporting you, they may have the ability to amend some of those depending on what the contract you enter into. But ideally you'd have something that's template and you can kind of use as and when you contract, and that bit's done. The next thing to talk about is commercial agreements, and this ultimately really depends on your business and how you're operating. But there's some contracts, which I think Emma mentioned earlier, things like IP licenses. You might have a collaboration agreement, or you might have a non-disclosure agreement if you want to kind of control, who's available, the confidential information about your company, or how they can or can't share that. So that really depends on what the business is doing, but definitely worth thinking about when you're established and you're going and having your impact. The third thing to talk about is employment. So as your business becomes more established, you might want to bring other people in to support your impact. And you can engage them in a variety of ways. It's probably worth speaking to an employment lawyer to kind of guide which way is the best way of doing this, but you could employ them as an employee, so paying pensions, all that kind of stuff. They have certain rights under employment law, or you could engage them as a consultant with a bit more flexibility for both sides, and obviously different tax implications as well. So it depends what you're doing and your kind of plans of what you want to do with the people side, but it's definitely worth thinking about as well. The fourth thing to mention is kind of growth and investment. So earlier Emma talked about if you're complemented by shares, you can receive money in exchange for shares in the company. So you could think about which investors you want to approach. If you want to get investors, are they aligned to the impact you want to have? And is that a really good way for you to further the reach and scope of your organization? That might not be right for your business, but it's an option there if you're a company limited by shares. And finally, data protection. So it's important to have, ensure you're complying with data protection law by having things like a privacy policy, privacy notice, and cookies if you're having those on your website, and making sure it's really clear what you're doing with the personal data, and you're doing it in compliance with data protection legislation. So if you're doing something that's a bit more complex with data, you might have to register with the ICO, which is kind of the regulator of data protection in the UK. But I think as a starting point, it's definitely advisable to kind of make sure the privacy notice is in place and accessible on your website, and people know what you are doing with the data if you are doing anything. So they're the kind of three categories of things when you're setting up and establishing a social venture. But now we're going to go on to part 5 of our session, which is the resources. So we've got a couple of resources here, and obviously welcome to scan the QR code as I'm talking, or you'll get the slide deck after the session. You can go ahead there. But the kind of 2 resources on this slide to mention is our social venture handbook. So this is a handbook which goes in perhaps a bit more detail about some of the stuff that Emma and I talked about today. Anyone can read it, download it for free, and hopefully there's some helpful hints and tips there as you're getting up and establishing your social venture. The next resource on this slide is our report called Impact Investment, Intentionality and Innovation. So we've prepared this report after conducting interviews with 36 different experts in the impact investment space, so companies that received impact investment, or organization or funders that provide impact investment. So that was launched in October with the idea to kind of talk a bit more about impact investment, which is basically an organization giving you money in exchange for shares in your company, but they're also wanting to back the kind of social and or environmental impact you're having as well. So if you want to download that and read that, more than welcome to. And there's also various podcast interviews which we've done as well flowing out of that. So hopefully that's an interesting resource if you're looking to go down the impact investment route. And as we mentioned earlier, we've got virtual pop-ups. So these are free half-an-hour sessions with someone from our social venture team to talk about your business and where you want to go, and kind of perhaps go into a bit more depth than we talked about today. So in terms of signing up for these sessions, we tend to advise it's worth having a look at the social venture handbook before you sign up for a session, because then you should be able to get more from the session. And obviously you've all watched the session today as well, so you should be prepared to have those conversations as well. So if you'd like to sign up, head over to the QR code and fill in a bit of information about yourself and your business, and then we can go from there and have a chat. But now I'm going to go on to the final part of our session, which is the Q&A session. So I can't actually see any questions on my side of the screen because I'm sharing, but Emma might be able to her side.
Just popping in there. Thanks so much, Kira and Emma. That was a great whistle-stop tour of setting up a social venture. I don't know whether either one of you just want to address Kat and Emma's comments about legal legal structures, the B Corp and social enterprise not being legal structures.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're quite right. They're not legal structures, as we mentioned. It's the company limited by guarantee that absolutely is the sort of general, or sorry, limited by shares. That's the general underlying structure. The reason we plot them on our social venture scale is that when we've had a number of conversations with social founders, individuals have come to us saying, and what about B Corps, and what about social enterprises and the like. So I think because the social venture scale is so wide, and you can almost see of it as a bit of a grey area, you know, people sort of know some of the terms but maybe don't quite know what each of those really mean, and where those sort of different elements fall. It's worth, I think, sort of just having a more broader conversation and saying, you know, actually the memberships that come with them, for example, in the case of a social enterprise SE UK membership, or the certification process and badging for a B Corp, can still be something that's valuable for a social venture, but you, as I say, may want to underpin it at a constitutional level by enshrining a chosen social or environmental mission in your company documents, and therefore it's a sort of a nice to have and top up that might help from a sort of, you know, bigger branding marketing perspective.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I think it's really useful in this kind of introductory session as well to cover those as well, because I think that people have a lot of questions about the B Corp certification, definitely. And as you say, there's a lot of marketing around it at the moment. So yeah, great. Okay, so if we open it up to the room, if anybody's got any questions, feel free to either pop them in the chat or just pop your hand up. If not, we can I'll share my so you'll have my details and follow-up email, so you can always just send me any questions after this session as well, if anything comes to mind. Great. I don't think we've got any questions. So if we want to finish there.
I think there's a hand up.
Oh, is there? Is that Emma? Go for it.
Hi, I'm Zanette. I wanted to ask two questions. Thank you for the presentation. It's very insightful. The first one is, what is your relationship with Mishcon, and how does that influence what you do? And the second question is, if one sort of takes you on for all the legal work, do you also help with strategic partnerships and stuff like that? Thanks.
Yeah, great. So very, very happy to answer those. So we are Taylor Vinters, but Taylor Vinters merged with Mishcon as of the 1st of January this year. So we have maintained our brand name, hence why we're still Taylor Vinters and have our existing email addresses. But we're working with a broader range of colleagues now within the wider sort of Mishcon framework, which is actually really useful for our social venture and not-for-profit clients, because we now have access to internal expertise that we didn't when we were the smaller outfit that was Taylor Vinters. So we're very excited about collaborating with a wider group of clients, but we still absolutely have maintained our core social and charities team from Taylor Vinters. We've all moved across. We all still work for, you know, the same types of clients. As I say, we just sort of have a greater reach, if you like, an expertise now that we can call on from our internal colleagues. At the sort of strategic point, absolutely, yeah, we can help in sort of navigating some of those bigger commercial issues that sort of come to play once you've got that legal wrapper set up. Very happy to sort of assist with strategic advice in that sense, but we also have a number of individuals and networks that we know very well in that space as well, so we can suggest useful people and contacts that might be useful as well to help provide some additional advice and support in a number of areas. But we'd like to certainly sort of see that we can provide a wider service and offering than just the core sort of legal bare bones, if you like.
Wonderful, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so just asked in the chat, how do you see mutual aid fit into this context?
I wonder, Kay, could you provide a little bit more detail on that? I'm not quite sure what you mean by mutual aid.
Yeah, sure. It's just something that I've become aware of just recently, and increasingly so, that there's kind of a move away from the charitable sector, although that's going to take a while, but and looking more towards a mutual aid where people support one another. And I'm just so I'm wondering whether social enterprises might change with this in mind, because the social enterprise would be more looking at funding from charities and working in that kind of relationship. And I'd be curious to know how mutual aid might change that, if that can be. I mean, it's perhaps out of the realm of this conversation now. I'm just curious as to whether you had a view on that.
I think the different sort of funding options available for social enterprises, and certainly what we tend to see with those that have chosen the company structure to sort of take their social enterprise or social venture forward. Absolutely, some, particularly if they're a company limited by guarantee, might be more aligned and have greater affinity with those charitable institutional grant funders. But there is actually a really exciting space that is starting to develop around impact investment and the sort of more fluidity and flex that comes from that. I mean, Kieran has a number of great connections there and was very closely involved in the development of our impact funding report. So Kieran, perhaps I'll let you sort of say a few points on the growth of that space.
Yeah, sure. So I think more and more organisations are looking to receive funding to accelerate their impact. They kind of want aligned organisations that want to support that as well as get a financial return. I think in terms of your question about mutual aid, I, to be honest, hadn't really heard of that until I had a quick Google about it, and looking at it now, I think that might be a separate thing to this kind of social venture space, because I think the social ventures, as we talked about earlier, they're kind of they combine the profit and the purpose, whereas in my quick, literally 2-minute Google of mutual aid, I'm not quite sure if the profit element is in that aspect. And I think that's not to say that it's a bad thing, or it's the wrong thing. I think in the social venture space, it's kind of shifting the idea of what profits to kind of accelerate that impact and have impact in other ways, whereas mutual benefit might be a really good way to do that on a more localized scale, potentially, or individual people. But I'm not sure if it's married up. But after the session, I'm going to have a bit more deeper dive into it and see if there are any synergies.
I'm sorry, I realize that I've just thrown this curveball to you,
okay.
But I was just curious as to during the presentation, it just occurred to me that will shift the social enterprise spectrum a little bit, and I was just curious as to. Sorry about throwing the curveball. But
that's good. We like curveballs. There's lots of stuff going on in this sector and lots of interesting ideas, and yeah, the more we know about this, the better we can spread that word amongst our clients and contacts. So thanks for sharing that. And I said I'll have a quick look offline, and
thank you.
Have to pick up the conversation again. But I'd like to get a bit more detail.
Cheers.
Brilliant, thanks, Kay. Kat's also shared some useful links in the chat as well about co-ops, which I will put into my follow-up email as well, which might be useful. Brilliant. Any other questions? Great. Let's leave it there for today, I think, because we're nearly at the top of the hour. But thank you so much, Kieran. That was a really good kind of overview of the social venture space. And yeah, as I say, I will send an email with all the details of this session and future sessions to come as well. And if you've got any questions following today, please just get in touch with me. But thank you again, and thank you for joining us today. See you later. Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, great session.